Welcome back, dear friends. Tonight, we are going to wander together into a world that may seem strange at first, a world where rules often made little sense, yet shaped the lives of ordinary people in ways they could not always explain. Before we settle in, if you enjoy drifting into these quiet stories of the past, please consider subscribing so we can explore more gentle histories together at a calm, soothing pace. Now, let us lean back, take a deep, slow breath, and imagine stepping quietly into a medieval village. The sun is just beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting a soft, golden haze over cobblestone streets. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys, and the soft chatter of villagers blends with the faint clatter of a horse's hooves on stone. In this world, rules guided every little action. Some made sense at first glance, while others, well, they seemed curious, even puzzling, to anyone trying to understand them today. Life in the medieval period was structured, carefully organized, and bound by traditions that had grown over centuries. People rose with the sun, worked steadily through the day, and rested when evening arrived. Yet, behind this rhythm, there existed rules that could feel arbitrary, odd, or even whimsical. These were rules that controlled everything, from what you wore, to the bread you baked, to the music you were allowed to play. And though some of these rules were made with good intentions, others seemed simply to keep life complicated. Imagine, if you will, a child stepping out into the village square, curious and wide-eyed. The cobblestones are cool beneath their bare feet, and the scent of baking bread drifts from the oven nearby. That child is about to learn the ways of the world, guided by rules that can feel like invisible hands, shaping how they move, how they speak, and how they eat. Some rules are easy to follow, natural even, like not touching a hot oven or listening quietly during prayer. Others, not so much. Some rules might even make a modern visitor scratch their head and wonder, why? Let us take a moment to consider why these unusual rules existed. Medieval society was deeply hierarchical. Life was built on a delicate balance of power, with kings and queens at the top, lords and ladies below, and common folk like farmers, bakers, and merchants navigating a complex web beneath them. Rules were often tools of control, meant to preserve order or sometimes to demonstrate who had authority over whom. Yet life was not all about rigidity. Amid the structure, people laughed, loved, worked, and created small pockets of freedom wherever they could. As we glide through this story, try to picture these curious laws not as mere restrictions, but as whispers from a long-ago world, hinting at fears, ambitions, and values that shaped every day. Perhaps, in a way, they were attempts to make life predictable, to impose a sense of calm in times that could otherwise be confusing, dangerous, or uncertain. Yet, not all rules were wise, and over time, many had to be rewritten, bent, or quietly ignored. And it is these particular rules, the ones that puzzle people most, that we will explore tonight. One such rule involved the simplest, most ordinary parts of daily life. For instance, consider the laws that govern movement. In many towns, walking or traveling outside of approved areas required permission, sometimes from a local lord, sometimes from the king himself. A traveler could not simply wander the countryside without notice. This may seem strange now, but back then, it was a way to control trade, prevent crime, and keep track of the population. Life was fragile, resources were limited, and rulers often worried that without regulation, chaos would spread like wildfire. But as we will see, not all rules were purely practical. Some were symbolic, marking social boundaries or emphasizing the difference between rich and poor, noble and commoner. Sumptuary laws, for example, dictated what colors or fabrics one could wear, depending on social rank. A simple ribbon, a pair of shoes, or a cloak could tell everyone in the marketplace who belonged where and who did not. Wearing the wrong shade of green or a forbidden pattern could be met with a fine or worse, public humiliation. For the villagers, these restrictions were a daily, quiet reminder of their place in the world. And yet, life found ways to flow around these constraints. Bakers, for example, were restricted in the types of bread they could bake, often by weight or ingredient. A loaf might be required to meet exact specifications, not because it tasted better, but because laws said so. The goal was fairness, avoiding deception, and maintaining stability in a time when even food shortages could spark unrest. Over time, however, some clever bakers discovered subtle ways to innovate, gently pushing the limits of what was allowed. And slowly, the rules began to change, giving them more freedom to create and delight the senses of those who tasted their bread. Rules also reached into the night. In some towns, life after sunset was tightly controlled. Shops would close, streets would empty, and lanterns were limited. The world became quiet, not entirely for safety, but to maintain order. People were expected to stay home, rest, and avoid wandering into unknown dangers. It is easy to imagine the streets after dusk, empty but for a few cautious figures moving softly, the air carrying the scent of damp earth, smoke, and hay. In this way, the night was a rule-bound space, a pause that forced the village to breathe slowly together as one community. Even music was regulated. Certain instruments, certain songs, and even certain styles could be allowed or forbidden, depending on who held authority. Minstrels traveling from town to town had to know which tunes pleased the local rulers and which might provoke anger. In some places, the flute or drum was considered proper. In others, it was forbidden. These restrictions, while odd to us today, were part of the invisible threads that held society together, guiding mood, behavior, and expectation. Yet, as centuries passed, musicians found clever ways to bend the rules, creating new melodies that eventually became accepted and cherished. And there was dining, a surprisingly complex area of life. Sharing cups, passing plates, and following strict manners could be dictated by local custom or written law. Sometimes, a single cup was shared among several diners, not just as a matter of hygiene, but as a ritual, a symbol of unity, or even obedience. Slowly, as ideas about comfort, cleanliness, and personal space evolved, these rules melted away, giving rise to more personal freedom at the table. It is in these small moments that the slow, gentle transformation of society becomes most visible. As we drift through the story, you may notice a rhythm. Life in the medieval world, with all its strange, puzzling rules, moved carefully, deliberately, almost like a slow river winding through a forest. Every custom, every restriction had a purpose, some obvious, some hidden. And when those rules changed, Life shifted as quietly as the seasons, opening small doors of freedom, curiosity, and creativity. Tonight, as we explore these unusual laws, it is important to remember that the medieval world was not uniform. Villages differed from towns, kingdoms differed from regions, and a law in one place might not exist 10 miles away. Yet, the shared thread is that people like you and me lived under the influence of rules that sometimes made little sense, and yet shaped their entire day. There is a gentle comfort in that, perhaps a reminder that life, even when governed by strange regulations, found ways to move, breathe, and flourish. As our thoughts wander through this quiet village, imagine watching a blacksmith at his forge, shaping iron under the orange glow of the fire. The sparks rise slowly, floating for a moment before fading into darkness. The blacksmith follows rules passed down for generations, some about technique, some about safety, and others about tradition. Yet, even in this strict environment, creativity finds a path. A gentle tap here, a subtle twist there, and a new form emerges, quietly defying the old boundaries. And consider the children, learning to navigate a world of rules, some logical, some strange. They discover the nuances of obedience, the thrill of bending a small guideline without being caught, and the eventual realization that the world is flexible, ever-changing. As they grow, these lessons become stories whispered softly in the evening, tales of how the world once was, and how it eventually became a little freer, a little more open. So tonight, we begin our journey with an open mind, letting the past unfold slowly, like the last rays of sunlight melting into dusk. We will drift from street to street, from rule to rule, observing the peculiar, the curious, and the quietly transformative. We will see how a society, bound by strange customs, gradually learned to reshape itself, allowing imagination, kindness, and practicality to flourish in ways the old laws had never imagined. And as we wander softly from one rule to the next, imagine yourself strolling along the village paths, feeling the gentle breeze, hearing the faint echo of a lute somewhere in the distance, noticing the warm glow from a baker's oven, and the slow, steady rhythm of life as it unfolded, one day at a time. This is a world where rules matter deeply, yet where human ingenuity quietly carved paths around, beneath, and through them. In the next chapter, we will step into one of the most curious rules of all, a rule that dictated when life could continue and when it must pause. A rule that, at first, may seem limiting, almost suffocating, but that, over time, evolved into something more thoughtful, something more practical, something that shaped the way communities rested, worked, and lived together. We will explore it together, in gentle detail, noticing not just the rule itself, but the small changes that slowly reshaped everyday life. And so, we begin our soft, slow exploration of medieval rules, knowing that each curious law has a story, a whisper of the past, and a lesson in human ingenuity. Tonight, as your eyelids grow heavy, we will float through these moments, letting each rule unfold calmly, peacefully, and slowly, so that the past becomes a quiet companion on our journey to rest. The rule that no work could be done after sunset was one of the most pervasive and quietly influential laws in medieval towns. From the smallest hamlets to the bustling market towns, This regulation shaped the rhythm of daily life, dictating when people could labor, when shops could remain open, and when streets were expected to grow silent. It may sound simple to us now, a straightforward division between day and night, yet in practice, it touched nearly every aspect of life and created patterns that endured for generations. During daylight, the village or town was a place of constant motion. Farmers tended their fields, bakers kneaded dough for the day's bread, blacksmiths hammered iron on their anvils, and merchants set out goods for sale in the open marketplace. As the sun slowly arced across the sky, a quiet tension existed, an unspoken awareness that the hours were numbered. There was a rhythm to life that people internalized almost without thinking, a pace dictated by the movement of the sun and the rules that demanded their attention. The moment the sun began its descent, a soft urgency spread through the streets. Candle makers, millers, and carpenters glanced toward the sky, adjusting the pace of their work to finish tasks before darkness took hold. The law itself was simple in wording but strict in enforcement. All work, unless absolutely necessary, had to cease once the sun had vanished behind the horizon. Night was reserved for rest, reflection, and preparation for the next day. For ordinary people, this rule provided a clear boundary, a signal to wind down, yet it also imposed limits on productivity and creativity, forcing them to structure every task carefully within the daylight hours. In towns where the streets were narrow and houses closely packed, the rule had practical benefits as well. Without streetlights, walking through the evening could be dangerous. Cobblestones were uneven, open wells were common, and a simple misstep could result in injury or worse. By restricting labor and outdoor activity after sunset, the rule reduced accidents and provided a sense of safety. It also limited potential conflicts or crimes that could occur under the cover of darkness. In this sense, the rule was as much about social order and protection as it was about controlling labor. The enforcement of this rule varied by location. In some towns, town criers or watchmen patrolled the streets as twilight fell, gently reminding citizens that work should stop. Bakers would close their ovens, merchants would fold up their stalls, and blacksmiths would cover their forges. In other places, the law was enforced more loosely, with local leaders relying on communal expectations rather than strict punishment. Even where enforcement was light, the rule was respected, woven into the rhythm of life so thoroughly that most people observed it naturally, like an inherited habit. The effect on commerce was significant. Markets, which often began in the early morning, had to conclude by late afternoon. Vendors prepared for the end of trading well before the sun had fully disappeared, packing up wares and tallying accounts in the fading light. This created a sense of urgency, a gentle pressure that moved the day along, ensuring that towns did not linger in an unstructured or chaotic state. Customers, too, were aware of the schedule. They shopped with attention, hurrying to complete purchases before the streets emptied. In this way, the law structured social interactions as carefully as it regulated labor. For artisans, the rule was both a limitation and an invisible guide. Blacksmiths had to pace their work according to the hours of daylight, choosing which pieces to finish and which could wait until morning. Carpenters adjusted their measurements and cutting plans to fit within the available light. Even writers, scholars, or monks copying manuscripts in small script had to account for the setting sun, often relying on natural light rather than candles, which were expensive and sometimes forbidden for regular use outside sacred spaces. This limitation, while restrictive, encouraged efficiency and careful planning, teaching people to value their time and focus on essential tasks. The rule's impact extended to families as well. Household routines were structured around the sun. Meals were prepared and eaten early enough that cooking and cleaning could be completed before the evening. Children finished chores, tended animals, and completed schoolwork or lessons with the rhythm of daylight guiding their pace. As night approached, homes quieted. Lamps or hearth fires provided gentle light, but active labor ceased. Even conversation slowed. In this way, the law shaped not only public life but the intimate, domestic rhythms of ordinary people. Religious practices intersected with the law in subtle ways. Many towns observed specific prayers or services in the evening, often coinciding with the end of permissible labor. By synchronizing work limits with spiritual observances, the rule reinforced a sense of order that was both practical and symbolic. It reminded people that life was divided into phases: work, rest, reflection, and devotion. In this sense, the restriction on labor after sunset became part of a broader philosophy of life, where daily routines were aligned with natural cycles and moral rhythms. Yet, the law was not without its challenges. Harvest seasons, for example, created situations where the daylight hours were insufficient to complete essential tasks. Farmers, needing to gather crops before they spoiled, sometimes worked past sunset using lanterns, torches, or candlelight despite the restrictions. In some cases, local authorities issued temporary permissions or exemptions, understanding that rigid adherence could result in real harm or loss. Similarly, in towns with active trading networks, merchants occasionally extended hours into twilight to meet the demands of customers from neighboring villages. These exceptions illustrate that even strict rules were flexible when necessity dictated, and human ingenuity found ways to navigate limitations quietly. Interestingly, the rule also influenced leisure and social life. With work ending at a set hour, people gradually adapted evenings for rest, conversation, music, and storytelling. The shared experience of pausing as darkness fell created a rhythm of communal relaxation. Streets emptied, fires were lit in homes, and families gathered to share food or tell tales of the day's events. In this way, the restriction on labor indirectly encouraged reflection, bonding, and calm, demonstrating that laws can shape behavior in subtle, beneficial ways beyond their immediate intent. Over time, the rule began to evolve. As street lighting improved, particularly in larger towns and cities, and as trade networks expanded, the strict division between day and night gradually loosened. Some work could safely continue after sunset without the hazards that had once justified the restriction. The development of more reliable candles, lanterns, and eventually gas or oil lamps extended the hours available for labor. Markets stayed open later, artisans could continue projects after dark, and travel became safer. Gradually, the law's authority diminished, though the habit of winding down at a certain hour persisted culturally for generations. The legacy of this rule is subtle but enduring. It shaped the pace at which medieval societies moved, instilled habits of efficiency and planning, and created a natural transition from active labor to rest. Even after the legal requirement faded, people continued to observe the pattern in their daily lives. Work began in the morning, progressed steadily, and ended as evening approached, leaving space for family, leisure, and quiet reflection. The law, in a way, taught the value of rhythm, balance, and mindfulness, offering lessons that remain relevant even today. While at first glance the restriction may seem arbitrary, it is clear that the rule of no work after sunset played a vital role in shaping medieval society. It protected people, structured communities, and created a predictable cadence for daily life. It also influenced social interactions, family routines, and spiritual observances. And as time passed, the rule adapted, giving way to new practices and freedoms while leaving behind a gentle imprint on how people organized their hours and valued their time. The end of labor at sunset was not merely a rule of law. It was a reflection of the world's natural rhythms, a quiet understanding that human life flows best when aligned with light and dark, activity and rest. It encouraged reflection, efficiency, and communal harmony, teaching lessons about balance that reached far beyond the simple cessation of work. Through the lens of this rule, we can see how ordinary people navigated constraints, created structure in their lives, and ultimately learned to adapt and innovate within the boundaries imposed upon them. And so, as the sun sank behind distant hills, the streets of the village grew still. The smiths covered their forges, the bakers closed their ovens, and merchants folded their stalls. Families gathered indoors, and the quiet rhythm of night settled gently over the town. The rule that once seemed rigid and perhaps even confining had shaped life in ways both subtle and profound, leaving behind a legacy of order, mindfulness, and the slow, steady dance between work and rest. Even as centuries passed and the law became less strict, the echo of its influence remained, a reminder that human activity is often best tempered by the quiet wisdom of natural cycles. Medieval towns learned, slowly and softly, that the world itself has a rhythm worth following, and that rules, no matter how strange they may seem, can sometimes guide life toward balance, peace, and calm reflection. The medieval world was a place where appearance mattered in ways that might feel surprising to us today. Beyond the simple need for warmth, comfort, or durability, clothing was a language, a silent expression of social position, wealth, and status. And in many regions, this language was not left to personal choice. Sumptuary laws, as they were called, dictated precisely what people could wear, down to the colors, fabrics, and decorations. These rules were often intricate, sometimes peculiar, and they shaped daily life with a quiet, pervasive authority that few could ignore. The law of wearing the right colors applied differently depending on who one was and where one lived. A duke or duchess could display luxurious fabrics dyed in vivid shades, often reserved exclusively for royalty or the very wealthy. Commoners, in contrast, were restricted to muted tones, simple weaves, and plain patterns. Even the choice of a ribbon or a pair of gloves could convey messages about wealth, lineage, and social hierarchy. In towns where trade and travel were common, the color of a cloak could identify a visitor's region, profession, or rank, and thus people learned early to read these signals. both to recognize status and to avoid drawing unwanted attention. These rules were, in part, practical. The nobility and ruling classes sought to maintain clear distinctions, making social rank visible to all. Clothing became a way to reinforce hierarchy without the need for verbal commands or constant supervision. A wealthy merchant might be allowed certain shades of red, while a peasant would be restricted to brown, gray, or undyed fabrics. The subtle differences in color and material served as reminders of the social order, a visual rhythm that guided interactions and expectations throughout the community. In addition to practical considerations, there were moral and symbolic reasons behind these restrictions. Some colors were associated with virtues, religious significance, or specific professions. Wearing a color deemed inappropriate could be seen as presumptuous, disrespectful, or even morally questionable. A person's choice of attire was not merely a matter of fashion. It reflected values, obedience, and understanding of social norms. Breaking the law by wearing forbidden colors could result in fines, public censure, or a demand to change garments immediately. The rules were enforced with a quiet severity that reinforced the social fabric in subtle but firm ways. The impact on everyday life was immediate and tangible. Parents dressed their children according to their social standing, guiding them in the intricate code of colors and patterns that would signal their place in the world. Young people learned to navigate marketplaces and gatherings with care, understanding that a misplaced ribbon or overly bright garment could attract attention or disapproval. Artisans who produced clothing had to maintain inventories that conformed to regulations, often producing garments in muted shades for commoners and reserving more elaborate dyes for wealthier clients. Every decision about fabric, thread, and color was influenced by these quietly persistent rules. Travelers entering a town also had to be mindful. The colors they wore could indicate whether they belonged, whether they were respected, or whether they risked scrutiny. Merchants moving between regions carried clothing that allowed them to blend in or identify themselves appropriately, adapting to local laws and expectations. Even casual strolls through a town square required awareness, for the visual language of clothing was omnipresent, shaping perception and dictating social behavior in ways that were subtle yet powerful. The law's influence extended to social gatherings, ceremonies, and festivals. Weddings, religious observances, and public celebrations were all occasions where the proper colors were expected. A misstep could create embarrassment, signal disrespect, or even attract fines. The careful observance of dress codes reinforced a sense of communal order and harmony, subtly reminding everyone of their role and responsibilities. In a world without mass communication, the visual cues embedded in clothing were a practical way to maintain social cohesion and manage expectations without the need for constant verbal instruction. Yet, as with many medieval laws, enforcement varied. Some regions applied strict scrutiny, with officials inspecting garments and noting infractions. Other towns relied on social pressure, trusting that neighbors, peers, and community leaders would encourage compliance. Often, public embarrassment or gossip served as a more effective deterrent than formal punishment. In this way, the law worked both through formal mechanisms and through a quiet, almost invisible network of social norms that shaped behavior. Artisans and dyers navigated these rules with care and creativity. The production of dyes was an intricate craft, involving plants, minerals, and sometimes expensive imports. Certain colors, like deep purples or bright reds, were difficult and costly to produce, which reinforced their association with wealth and status. Dyers had to manage their inventories carefully, knowing which shades could be sold to whom and when. Yet, within these constraints, they found subtle ways to innovate, producing nuanced variations or blending colors in ways that allowed clients to express individuality without breaking the law. For common people, the law could feel restrictive, limiting personal expression and individuality. However, over time, it also encouraged creativity in other ways. People experimented with accessories, embroidery, and layering, finding quiet methods to add personal flair while remaining within the letter of the law. Small variations in stitching, the addition of a simple decorative clasp, or the clever arrangement of layers became ways to navigate restrictions while still embracing a sense of style. These quiet acts of ingenuity demonstrate how rules, even when limiting, often inspire adaptation and subtle rebellion. The law also had economic implications. Wealthy patrons paid premiums for the right dyes, rare fabrics, and officially sanctioned garments. The demand for restricted colors created markets that were tightly controlled, with merchants and dyers negotiating carefully to supply what was permissible. Meanwhile, the restricted choices for the majority reinforced economic hierarchies, ensuring that wealth remained visible and social boundaries clear. These economic patterns were subtle, intertwined with daily life, and influenced the flow of goods, labor, and craft in ways that extended far beyond the simple act of choosing clothing. Religious symbolism often intertwined with color restrictions as well. Clergy, for instance, were bound to specific robes that conveyed rank, office, and spiritual authority. Lay people, in turn, were expected to respect these visual hierarchies, reinforcing the intertwining of social and spiritual order. Colors could indicate mourning, celebration, or religious devotion, adding layers of meaning to daily appearance. Understanding these codes became part of the quiet education of villagers and townsfolk, who learned to interpret clothing as a language of both status and values. Despite the rigidity of these rules, people found ways to bend them subtly. Jewelry, sashes, and small decorative items could be used to introduce color and personality without directly violating the law. Layering garments allowed for combinations that maintained the mandated outer appearance while offering glimpses of creativity beneath. These quiet acts of expression became part of the rhythm of medieval life, a gentle negotiation between law and individual desire, between tradition and personal freedom. Over time, pressures for change emerged. Trade increased, travel became more common, and the rise of new social classes challenged the rigid distinctions enforced by sumptuary laws. Merchants and artisans, increasingly influential and wealthy, desired the freedom to display their success in ways previously reserved for the nobility. Cultural shifts, the spread of fashion trends, and practical considerations all combined to erode the strict observance of color regulations. By the late medieval period, the once rigid rules began to relax, allowing people greater choice and encouraging new forms of self-expression. The evolution of these laws reveals much about the interplay between authority and individuality. At first, the law of wearing the right colors served as a clear and visible marker of social hierarchy, reinforcing order and predictability. It guided behavior, shaped interactions, and even influenced economic activity. Yet, over time, the desires, ingenuity, and creativity of individuals gradually softened these restrictions. People discovered ways to innovate within the rules, and eventually the rules themselves adapted to changing society. Clothing, in this sense, was never merely functional. It was a canvas for negotiation, a quiet expression of identity, and a reflection of evolving social norms. The law of color, while initially rigid and seemingly arbitrary, played a role in shaping community, reinforcing values, and providing structure. Its gradual relaxation illustrates how societies are living entities, capable of evolving, bending, and reshaping themselves in response to human needs and creativity. By examining the law of wearing the right colors, we gain insight into the delicate balance medieval communities maintained between order and freedom, restriction and creativity. We see how laws, even those that might seem odd to us today, served multiple purposes: social cohesion, moral guidance, economic control, and the subtle shaping of behavior. We also witness the quiet resilience of human imagination, as people learn to work within and eventually expand the boundaries imposed upon them. Even in towns where the law remained technically in force, the visible evidence of its flexibility emerged in small details. A hidden trim of bright fabric, an unusual sash carefully concealed beneath a cloak, or a carefully dyed ribbon peeking from a sleeve. These subtle choices speak of a world in which laws, though firm in appearance, were tempered by practicality, creativity, and human desire. They remind us that even the strictest rules are not immune to the quiet persistence of personal expression. Ultimately, the law of wearing the right colors illustrates the interplay between control and adaptation, structure and creativity. It shaped the rhythm of life, influenced social interactions, and marked the boundaries of acceptable behavior, all while leaving room, however small, for subtle defiance and innovation. As the centuries passed, the colors once forbidden became available to more people, and society grew more flexible, more expressive, and more open. The law, once a symbol of rigid hierarchy, gradually became a lesson in negotiation, adaptation, and the enduring human desire for choice and self-expression. Through the lens of this law, we can appreciate the careful, slow unfolding of social change. Medieval towns were not static. They were dynamic spaces where rules guided behavior, yet also offered opportunities for subtle transformation. Clothing became a mirror of these shifts, reflecting both the authority of tradition and the quiet creativity of individuals. It is in this interplay that we find a window into the daily lives, struggles, and ingenuity of people long ago, whose world was both constrained by law and enriched by imagination. Bread was not merely food in the medieval world. It was a symbol of life, sustenance, and community. It appeared on every table in towns and villages alike and fed people from every level of society. Because of its importance, the production of bread was strictly regulated, and for centuries, medieval laws dictated not only what ingredients could be used, but also the weight, shape, and even texture of loaves. These rules, though created with practical intentions, often seemed peculiar or unnecessarily rigid, and they shaped everyday life in ways that touched nearly everyone. from the bakers at their ovens to the families who shared meals at their tables. At the heart of these regulations were concerns about fairness and standardization. Grain was a vital resource, and its availability fluctuated with seasons and weather. Bakers, therefore, were required to produce loaves of a certain weight, ensuring that customers received what they paid for and preventing the hoarding or misrepresentation of essential goods. A loaf that was too small or underweight could be considered a serious violation, punishable by fines, public censure, or other penalties. In this sense, the law was both practical and protective, designed to prevent disputes, maintain trust, and stabilize the food supply. Yet, the rigidity of these laws often seemed excessive. Bakers were restricted in the types of flour they could use, the amount of yeast, and sometimes even the techniques employed in shaping the dough. Innovation was limited and creativity constrained by the invisible hand of regulation. A baker could not easily experiment with new recipes or introduce variations in texture or flavor without risking penalty. The rules, designed to ensure fairness and consistency, also imposed a quiet monotony, a structure that left little room for personal expression in one of the most fundamental aspects of daily life. The enforcement of bread laws was surprisingly detailed. Towns often appointed officials known as bread inspectors or bread waiters, whose task was to monitor production closely. They visited bakeries, measured loaves, examined ingredients, and recorded compliance with established standards. The presence of these inspectors reminded bakers that every loaf mattered, and that deviation from the prescribed norms could have consequences. In some towns, public scales were installed where customers could check the weight of purchased bread, creating transparency but also reinforcing the strict oversight that governed this essential part of life. Beyond weight and composition, shape was another element regulated by law. Round, oval, or oblong loaves were often mandated, depending on regional customs or market standards. A baker producing a loaf of irregular shape might face penalties, as the deviation could be seen as either wasteful or dishonest. The shape of bread became a subtle signal of compliance, a visible marker that the baker respected the rules and provided fair, consistent products. Families and customers came to recognize these shapes, associating them with reliability and trustworthiness. The laws governing bread also extended to the timing of production. Ovens were a communal resource in many villages, shared among several bakers or households. Regulations ensured that everyone had access in turn, that fuel was used efficiently, and that bread was baked at times that maintained freshness and availability for the community. A loaf baked too early or too late could violate local standards, disrupt supply, or even create resentment among neighbors waiting their turn. The rhythm of baking, therefore, became a carefully choreographed part of life, a sequence that balanced efficiency, fairness, and social cohesion. Social hierarchy further influenced bread regulations. Certain types of bread, made from finer flour or enhanced with special ingredients, were reserved for wealthier clients or nobility. Commoners were often restricted to coarser grains or specific weights, ensuring a clear distinction between social classes even at the most basic level of sustenance. This differentiation reinforced hierarchy quietly but firmly. Bread, a necessity, became a subtle tool for signaling status, reminding people of their place within the social order every time they broke it for a meal. Despite the apparent rigidity, bakers developed creative ways to navigate these rules. By varying scoring patterns on the surface of the loaf, shaping smaller rolls from larger batches, or experimenting with minor adjustments in baking time, bakers could introduce subtle variations without breaking the law. These small acts of ingenuity allowed for individuality and expression, even in a system that demanded uniformity. Over time, these innovations became quietly accepted, laying the groundwork for broader freedoms in baking practices. The law also influenced economics in unexpected ways. Flour, a critical ingredient, was a commodity carefully monitored by authorities. Bakers who attempted to reduce costs or increase profits by using inferior grains risked violating regulations, yet they also sought to maintain quality while remaining competitive. This tension created a careful balance between legality, craftsmanship, and commerce. Markets for bread flour, yeast, and fuel were closely tied to these rules, demonstrating how legislation in one area of daily life rippled through the broader economic system. Bread regulations intersected with community life in ceremonial and cultural contexts as well. Festivals, religious observances, and special feasts often required specific types of bread, sometimes baked according to long-standing local traditions. Bakers had to comply with both the legal and customary standards, creating loaves that honored ritual, morality, and taste simultaneously. These occasions highlighted the role of bread not just as nourishment but as a cultural and social symbol, reinforcing the shared identity of the community. Families, too, felt the effects of these laws daily. Households needed to plan meals according to availability, bread type, and size. Mothers and fathers calculated portions carefully, knowing that irregular or insufficient loaves could disrupt family sustenance or offend neighbors if purchased from communal markets. Children, observing these routines, learned early about measurement, fairness, and the expectations of society. The law of bread subtly taught lessons in responsibility, patience, and attention to detail, guiding behavior far beyond the baker's oven. Exceptions and adjustments occurred when necessity demanded. During harvest seasons, times of famine, or crises caused by poor weather, local authorities sometimes allowed temporary variations in baking rules. Bakers could adjust loaf size, ingredients, or timing to ensure that all members of the community were fed. These exceptions reveal a flexibility that balanced strict regulation with practical human need. Even a law that seemed rigid could bend in moments of urgency, allowing society to adapt while preserving overall structure and order. The gradual relaxation of bread laws over time reflected broader social changes. As trade networks expanded and urban centers grew, bakers gained access to a wider variety of ingredients and techniques. Consumers demanded more variety and quality, and enforcement of strict uniformity became less practical. Gradually, innovation became more accepted, and bakers enjoyed greater freedom to experiment, invent new recipes, and respond to the tastes and preferences of their communities. What was once tightly regulated became a field for creativity, reflecting the evolving relationship between law, economy, and daily life. Interestingly, bread laws also shaped culinary habits beyond the bakery. Household cooking, the use of leftover bread, and preparation of secondary dishes were all influenced by what was available and legally sanctioned. Recipes evolved to incorporate standardized bread or to adapt to its texture and size. Community meals, inns, and taverns relied on predictable supply, creating a culinary rhythm tied to legal requirements. In this way, the law had an effect not only on bakers but on everyone who consumed bread, linking legislation, labor, and nourishment in a quiet but pervasive cycle. Over generations, the rule of baking bread in a prescribed manner became less about rigid enforcement and more about tradition, habit, and communal expectation. Bakers learned to respect the law while innovating, families relied on predictable quality, and towns maintained social cohesion through shared standards. The law, though strict, created a sense of reliability and trust that shaped the rhythm of everyday life. Its eventual relaxation did not erase these patterns, but transformed them into a system that balanced fairness, creativity, and cultural continuity. Through this lens, we see that the medieval law of bread production was far more than a simple rule. It was a framework for social, economic, and cultural life. It influenced trade, community relationships, family routines, and even culinary traditions. Its strictness encouraged innovation, teaching bakers and households alike to navigate boundaries with care and creativity. And as the centuries passed, it gradually softened, allowing for a richer, more varied relationship with one of the most fundamental elements of human sustenance. The story of bread illustrates the delicate interplay between law and life, restriction and ingenuity. A seemingly simple rule, what flour to use, how to shape a loaf, how to measure weight, created patterns that reached far beyond the oven. It taught discipline, fairness, and attention to detail, while also fostering subtle creativity within boundaries. It connected individual labor to community well-being, linking practical regulation with social expectation. And over time, as regulations eased, the law evolved alongside the people it governed, reflecting the quiet adaptability of human society. Even today, we can glimpse echoes of these medieval rules in baking traditions, regional recipes, and the careful attention to quality that persists in artisan bread making. The principles behind the law, the balance of fairness, consistency, and creativity, remain meaningful, reminding us that rules, even those that seem odd or restrictive, often shape life in ways both subtle and profound. Bread, once a regulated necessity, became a medium through which communities found stability, creativity, and continuity across generations. Travel in the medieval world was never entirely free. Roads were often rough, maps were scarce, and towns and regions maintained strict control over who could move within their borders. One of the most quietly influential rules of the time was that people could not travel freely without some form of permission. This rule existed for multiple reasons, from security to taxation, but it also shaped daily life, social patterns, and personal freedom in ways that touched nearly everyone. The law applied differently depending on status, location, and purpose, but its effects were universal, creating a rhythm and structure to movement that governed both ordinary and extraordinary journeys. In most towns and villages, traveling beyond one's home was not simply a matter of packing supplies and leaving. Citizens were often required to carry letters of authorization, passes from local lords, or proof of their social or economic standing. Merchants traveling to neighboring markets needed documentation to show that their goods were lawful and their intentions legitimate. Pilgrims heading to distant shrines or religious sites sometimes needed permits from religious authorities or local officials, ensuring that their presence would not disrupt order. Even simple journeys between villages required awareness of these expectations, a quiet negotiation between personal desire and social regulation. The law served practical purposes. Roads were shared spaces, and travel involved risks not only for the traveler but for communities along the way. Bandits, thieves, and political unrest made unregulated movement dangerous. By controlling travel, local authorities could reduce the likelihood of theft, prevent the spread of disease, and maintain social order. They could track who entered and exited towns, monitor the movement of goods, and enforce local economic and social policies more effectively. Permission was not simply a formality. It was a tool for safety, commerce, and governance, shaping the rhythm of daily life as surely as the rising and setting of the sun. For ordinary people, the rule of restricted travel created boundaries that were both visible and invisible. Villagers learned to plan journeys carefully, considering the time needed to obtain permission, the documentation required, and the limitations imposed by local authorities. A family seeking to sell produce in a neighboring town had to factor in both preparation and approval, which could take days or weeks. Students, apprentices, and servants often needed letters from masters or guardians to travel, connecting the practicalities of movement to social hierarchy and responsibility. This requirement reinforced a sense of order and accountability, embedding the law deeply into the rhythms of life. The regulation of movement extended to merchants and traders in particular. Markets were central to medieval economies, and trade networks relied on predictable travel. Authorities issued passes or safe-conduct documents to certify that travelers and their goods were legitimate. These permits often bore seals, signatures, or written endorsements, serving as proof of identity and purpose. Merchants learned the rules carefully, carrying multiple documents when moving across regions, sometimes consulting local officials along the way. Compliance was essential, and failure to secure proper permission could result in fines, confiscation of goods, or even imprisonment. Travel restrictions also shaped social and cultural patterns. Festivals, fairs, and public gatherings often required special authorization for outsiders to attend. Residents of one town could not simply visit another without considering both legal and social consequences. The law, therefore, created a rhythm to community life, influencing who participated in events, when gatherings occurred, and how communities interacted with one another. The regulation of travel reinforced local identity, emphasized boundaries, and encouraged people to invest in their immediate surroundings rather than seeking unregulated opportunities elsewhere. For those who traveled frequently, such as merchants, pilgrims, or messengers, the law of restricted movement shaped not only their routines but their entire approach to planning. Routes had to be chosen carefully, avoiding areas with known enforcement difficulties or seeking towns where documentation would be recognized. Travelers developed strategies to navigate complex systems of authority, sometimes relying on letters of introduction, local contacts, or guides familiar with regional practices. The law did not eliminate mobility but structured it, encouraging foresight, patience, and respect for authority. The enforcement of travel regulations varied widely. In some regions, local guards or watchmen would stop travelers at town gates, checking papers and questioning intentions. In other places, officials relied more on social pressure and communal oversight, trusting that travelers would follow established norms. Penalties for violation could be severe, ranging from fines to temporary imprisonment, yet enforcement was rarely violent unless the breach was significant or repeated. The law relied on a combination of formal mechanisms, informal oversight, and shared understanding to maintain its influence over movement. Travel permissions were not only practical but symbolic. Carrying a pass or letter signaled legitimacy, trustworthiness, and social standing. The documents themselves often bore symbols, seals, or endorsements that conveyed authority. In some cases, the decoration of the pass, such as a wax seal with an emblem, carried as much weight as the text, signaling compliance with social hierarchies and the broader legal system. Possessing proper documentation created a sense of confidence for the traveler and the community alike, reinforcing the idea that rules were a shared framework for order rather than arbitrary restrictions. The impact of this law extended to families and households as well. Children, servants, and apprentices were generally not permitted to travel alone. Parents or guardians were responsible for obtaining necessary permissions, and household routines were organized around these requirements. Planning a visit to relatives, attending markets, or participating in religious ceremonies required consideration of the law. Travel restrictions embedded the concepts of planning, accountability, and foresight into daily life, ensuring that movement within and beyond the community was deliberate and structured. Over time, exceptions emerged. Certain individuals, such as clergy, nobles, or official messengers, often enjoyed exemptions or special privileges allowing freer travel. Pilgrims traveling long distances sometimes received passes from religious authorities, granting temporary permission to cross multiple territories. These exceptions illustrate the flexibility of the system, allowing for necessity, service, or status to override general restrictions while still maintaining the overall order of society. Necessity and hierarchy intersected with law to create a complex and adaptive system that balanced regulation with practicality. The law also had economic implications. Merchants who could navigate permission systems successfully gained advantages, accessing markets, trade routes, and opportunities that others could not. Delays in obtaining documentation could result in mistrade, spoilage of perishable goods, or lost income. At the same time, the system ensured that local authorities could collect fees or taxes related to movement, adding a financial layer to the regulation. Travel, commerce, and governance became intertwined in subtle, almost invisible ways, demonstrating the deep influence of this law on medieval life. Cultural impact was similarly profound. The regulation of movement shaped social networks, religious observance, and communal participation. People learned to respect boundaries, coordinate plans, and negotiate relationships carefully. Festivals, pilgrimages, and market days became structured events, with travel permissions influencing attendance and participation. The law, therefore, was not merely a restriction. It was a framework that structured cultural rhythms, encouraged planning, and reinforced social cohesion. In practice, some travelers found ways to navigate the system creatively. Letters of introduction, endorsements from respected figures, or alliances with local authorities allowed movement beyond general restrictions. Travelers developed skills in diplomacy, observation, and negotiation, learning to read local customs, interpret social hierarchies, and gain trust in unfamiliar areas. These strategies illustrate how a seemingly rigid law could inspire adaptability, resourcefulness, and quiet ingenuity in those who navigated its boundaries. Travel restrictions also contributed to the preservation of local identity. Communities were less likely to be disrupted by outsiders, and social norms could remain relatively stable. The law limited sudden cultural shifts, ensured that local traditions persisted, and reinforced communal belonging. At the same time, it did not completely isolate communities. As approved travelers, merchants, and pilgrims facilitated the exchange of ideas, goods, and stories, maintaining a careful balance between protection and connection. The gradual loosening of these rules occurred as political structures stabilized, roads improved, and new forms of identification and record-keeping developed. Passports, letters of safe conduct, and standardized documentation eventually replaced the more localized systems, allowing freer movement while still preserving elements of oversight. Trade, cultural exchange, and travel flourished under these new arrangements, illustrating how the medieval system adapted to changing economic, social, and technological conditions. Through the lens of restricted travel, we see the careful balance medieval societies maintained between control and freedom. The law shaped daily routines, influenced social behavior, and created a structured rhythm to movement. It taught lessons in planning, responsibility, and respect for authority, while also fostering adaptability and ingenuity in those who navigated its limits. Even as the rules evolved and restrictions lessened, the principles behind them continued to influence patterns of travel, commerce, and social interaction. The rule that one could not travel without permission exemplifies the quiet power of law in medieval life. It demonstrates how regulations guided ordinary routines, structured economic activity, and reinforced social hierarchies. At the same time, it shows the resilience and creativity of human behavior as people learn to comply, negotiate, and innovate within the system. By understanding this law, we gain insight into the rhythms, priorities, and strategies that shaped the daily lives of those living centuries ago. Even as roads became safer and systems of documentation more sophisticated, the legacy of controlled travel persisted. People continued to plan journeys carefully, respect boundaries, and recognize the social and practical dimensions of movement. What began as a strict legal requirement gradually evolved into a combination of habit, social understanding, and practical necessity. Travel became not only a physical activity but a reflection of awareness, foresight, and social engagement, carrying forward lessons embedded in centuries of regulation and experience. The story of travel permissions is, in essence, a story of balance. It reflects the need to maintain order, ensure safety, and protect resources, while also accommodating human mobility, commerce, and curiosity. It illustrates how law can shape daily life in subtle yet profound ways, influencing not only what people do but how they think, plan, and interact. It shows that even rules that may seem restrictive or puzzling have a purpose, and that over time, societies learn to adapt, innovate, and grow within the frameworks established by authority. Through these centuries, the quiet presence of permission documents, watchful officials, and structured planning created a rhythm to movement that is almost invisible today, yet once determined the flow of life. Travelers, merchants, and families moved through towns and regions with awareness, intention, and respect for the rules that governed them. The system, though restrictive, taught patience, responsibility, and foresight, offering lessons that transcend time, connecting the medieval world to the values and habits that remain relevant in human experience. Even in its strictest form, the law of travel permission was not a barrier to life but a guide, shaping the pace, structure, and relationships of communities. It influenced commerce, culture, social interaction, and personal responsibility. It created patterns that encouraged careful planning, respect for boundaries, and thoughtful engagement with the world. And as the centuries passed, the law evolved, giving way to freer movement while leaving behind the subtle lessons embedded in centuries of structured travel. The rule that you could not travel without permission reminds us that law is not merely a set of restrictions but a framework for society. It illustrates the interplay between control and freedom, authority and adaptability, structure and human ingenuity. By studying this rule, we glimpse the daily rhythms of medieval life, the careful balance between order and flexibility, and the ways in which people navigated constraints while maintaining their creativity, responsibility, and social cohesion. In the medieval world, music was not simply entertainment. It was a carefully regulated part of life that carried social, religious, and political significance. Whether performed in a village square, within the walls of a castle, or in a church, music had to follow rules, and one of the most surprising was that music often required formal approval before it could be performed publicly. This regulation influenced daily life, personal expression, and community gatherings in subtle and pervasive ways, shaping not only the sounds that people heard, but also the rhythms of social interaction and cultural experience. Approval for music could take many forms. In towns and cities, local authorities often maintained oversight of musicians, ensuring that performances met established standards of appropriateness, taste, and decorum. In religious contexts, bishops or abbots had the authority to regulate hymns, chants, and instrumental accompaniment, approving certain compositions while forbidding others. In noble households, the lord or lady might dictate the repertoire performed during banquets or celebrations, emphasizing pieces that reflected status, heritage, or moral values. Musicians, therefore, navigated a complex network of social and legal expectations, learning to balance creativity with compliance. The rationale behind the rule was both practical and symbolic. Music, after all, had power. It could inspire joy, devotion, or celebration, but it could also incite unrest, ridicule authority, or convey subversive messages. By requiring approval, authorities sought to channel the influence of music in ways that supported order and reinforced social norms. Songs and melodies became not only artistic expressions but also instruments of social cohesion, conveying values, reinforcing hierarchy, and guiding behavior in subtle ways that extended far beyond the notes themselves. Musicians had to be mindful of several factors when seeking approval. The lyrics of songs were closely examined, particularly for religious or political content. Melodic structures and harmonies were evaluated for their consonance and adherence to accepted conventions. Instrumentation, performance context, and audience composition were all considered. A wandering minstrel performing a new composition in a town square might be questioned about the meaning of his words, while a composer writing for a cathedral choir had to submit arrangements for review by the clergy. This scrutiny created a framework in which music became a deliberate, carefully considered aspect of life rather than a spontaneous or purely personal activity. The impact of these regulations was felt across society. In villages, musicians often played only approved tunes during communal gatherings, ensuring that celebrations remained harmonious and aligned with local expectations. Street performers, traveling minstrels, and entertainers adapted their repertoires to meet the preferences of patrons and local authorities. Families attending feasts, markets, or festivals experienced music that was familiar, comfortable, and socially sanctioned, contributing to a shared cultural rhythm. Even the youngest members of the community absorbed these patterns, learning to recognize approved melodies and understand their social context. Religious institutions were especially influential in regulating music. Churches and monasteries oversaw the development of chants, hymns, and liturgical songs, creating detailed guidelines for rhythm, tone, and textual content. Choirs trained under these rules produced music that was carefully structured, harmonious, and intended to foster contemplation, devotion, and moral reflection. Deviations from approved compositions could be seen as inappropriate, distracting, or even sinful, emphasizing the moral dimension of musical regulation. Clergy, students, and aspiring musicians internalized these standards, passing them down through generations, creating continuity and stability within spiritual practice. The law also intersected with social hierarchy. Nobility, in particular, had a vested interest in controlling music. Performances at courtly events, banquets, or tournaments were carefully curated to reflect the status of the host and the expectations of visitors. Musicians seeking employment or patronage had to submit their work for approval, demonstrating both skill and adherence to social norms. The result was a musical culture in which innovation and artistry existed alongside careful observation of tradition and authority, producing a balance between creativity and conformity. In towns and cities, municipal authorities played a similar role. Public performances, celebrations, and festivals were subject to oversight, with officials approving music to ensure order, propriety, and inclusivity. Unauthorized performances could be met with fines, public admonition, or expulsion from the event. These regulations created a subtle social rhythm. Residents became accustomed to hearing approved music at expected times. Musicians planned their repertoire according to local expectations, and audiences developed shared tastes and cultural references that reinforced community cohesion. The requirement for approval also influenced the development of musical skill and composition. Aspiring musicians had to learn the rules and conventions thoroughly, mastering scales, harmonies, and textual appropriateness before experimenting with innovation. Composers studied approved works, internalizing patterns that could then serve as the foundation for new creations. Even seemingly spontaneous performances were often rooted in long practice, careful adherence to expectations, and negotiation with authorities. This framework of guidance and oversight, while restrictive in some ways, provided structure and discipline that shaped the musical tradition for generations. At the same time, musicians found creative ways to express individuality within these constraints. Variation in tempo, subtle ornamentation, dynamic performance, and clever wordplay allowed artistry to flourish even under regulation. Instrumentalists developed techniques to enrich melody and harmony without violating formal rules. Choirs explored expressive nuances while maintaining compliance with approved arrangements. These quiet acts of innovation illustrate the human capacity to adapt, balancing regulation with creativity, and demonstrating that even strict oversight could coexist with artistry and expression. Music approval laws also had economic dimensions. Skilled musicians relied on patronage from nobles, clergy, or municipal authorities, creating a system in which permission was directly tied to livelihood. Approved compositions could provide income and status, while failure to comply could jeopardize opportunities. Musical guilds and associations often formed around these practices, offering support, training, and negotiation strategies for members. Economic incentives reinforced adherence to regulation, linking creativity, social compliance, and financial stability in subtle yet profound ways. The rule also shaped education. Young musicians, apprentices, and students trained under mentors who emphasized the importance of approval, teaching the conventions, techniques, and social responsibilities embedded in musical law. Lessons were structured around approved repertoires, and progress was measured not only by skill but by understanding of regulations. Music became both an art and a discipline, combining technical mastery with social and moral awareness. Families invested time and resources to ensure that children learned these skills properly, creating continuity and transmitting knowledge across generations. Religious ceremonies, civic celebrations, and private gatherings all reflected the influence of music regulation. Approved songs created familiar auditory landscapes that reinforced identity, tradition, and community cohesion. Residents recognized melodies, anticipated patterns, and participated in shared experiences that connected them to broader social and spiritual rhythms. Music, therefore, was not merely background sound but a structured, deliberate, and socially meaningful element of daily life. Over time, these regulations evolved. The growth of universities, the expansion of trade, and increased cultural exchange introduced new forms of music and performance. While approval remained a factor, enforcement became more flexible, allowing experimentation and innovation to flourish alongside tradition. Musicians could introduce variations, adapt foreign influences, and explore new techniques while still honoring established norms. The balance between regulation and creativity shifted gradually, reflecting broader changes in society, culture, and technology. The legacy of this rule is evident in modern musical practice. Many compositional techniques, performance conventions, and educational methods have roots in the discipline created by approval systems. Musicians learned patience, attention to detail, and the importance of structure alongside artistic expression. Communities benefited from shared understanding of music, reinforcing social cohesion, cultural identity, and collective memory. The system, while seemingly restrictive, provided a framework that allowed both compliance and innovation to coexist. Even in informal contexts, the influence persisted. Street performances, family gatherings, and local festivals often adhered to familiar patterns, reflecting centuries of regulated tradition. Musicians carried the lessons of approval into private life, shaping taste, technique, and performance habits. Audiences, accustomed to approved melodies, developed expectations that guided perception, interpretation, and appreciation. Music became both a personal and communal experience, deeply intertwined with social norms and cultural continuity. The rule that music had to be approved also highlights the broader medieval perspective on authority, order, and creativity. Regulation was not merely punitive. It was instructive, guiding behavior, fostering skill, and shaping culture. Compliance required awareness, respect, and discipline, while creativity thrived within boundaries that provided structure and coherence. In this sense, the law of music approval reflects a philosophy in which human expression is framed by shared values, communal norms, and carefully considered oversight. Understanding this rule allows us to glimpse the daily experience of medieval musicians, audiences, and communities. It reveals a world in which sound, rhythm, and melody were not arbitrary but deeply connected to social, religious, and economic structures. It shows how rules shaped the flow of life, the development of skill, and the evolution of culture. And it illustrates the ways in which people adapted, innovated, and flourished even under constraints that might seem unusual or restrictive to us today. The requirement for approval also created a subtle sense of anticipation and expectation. Residents attending a feast, market, or religious ceremony knew that the music would be familiar, socially sanctioned, and appropriate for the occasion. Musicians prepared carefully, rehearsing pieces to meet approval standards, creating a sense of order and harmony. Audiences responded in turn, participating in shared experiences that reinforced communal identity and understanding. Music, therefore, became a medium through which the structure of society was expressed, experienced, and internalized. Even as regulations softened over time, the lessons of approval persisted. The balance between creativity and compliance, skill and discipline, structure and expression remained central to musical practice. Musicians retained the understanding that art flourishes most effectively within frameworks that provide guidance and context. Communities continued to benefit from shared cultural experiences that fostered cohesion, reflection, and continuity. The medieval system of music approval, though strict, left behind enduring insights into the interplay of law, art, and human behavior. Through this rule, we see how seemingly peculiar regulations shaped everyday life, guided social norms, and nurtured human ingenuity. Music, though constrained, became a channel for creativity, learning, and expression. Audiences, though guided by approval, experienced harmony, rhythm, and shared cultural meaning. The law of music approval demonstrates that rules, even when strict or unusual, can provide structure, inspire discipline, and cultivate artistry, leaving a lasting imprint on both individual lives and collective culture. In the medieval world, therefore, music was never merely sound. It was a reflection of society, a tool for cohesion, and a framework for creativity. Approval regulated content, performance, and context, influencing education, economy, and social interaction. Musicians learned to navigate constraints, innovate within boundaries, and communicate through a disciplined art form. Communities participated in a shared auditory experience, reinforcing identity, values, and continuity. And over time, these lessons endured, shaping not only the music of the past, but the practices and perspectives that continue to inform artistic expression today. In the medieval world, cleanliness was not merely a matter of personal comfort. It was a reflection of health, social order, and communal responsibility. Public baths played a central role in this system, yet the rules governing their use were strict, detailed, and sometimes surprising. These regulations influenced everyday routines, social interactions, and even personal habits, shaping the rhythms of life in ways that extended far beyond the walls of the bathhouse. Understanding these rules allows us to glimpse the careful balance between hygiene, morality, and community that characterized medieval life. Public baths were common in towns and cities, often maintained by municipal authorities or religious institutions. They provided a place for washing, relaxation, and social interaction, but access was carefully controlled. Men and women typically used baths at separate times or in different sections to maintain decorum. Specific hours were allocated for different social classes, and attendance often required a fee or a token of permission. These systems ensured that the facilities remained orderly, that everyone had access, and that hygiene standards could be maintained consistently across the community. One of the primary concerns behind these regulations was public health. Although the medieval understanding of disease was limited, authorities recognized that crowded, unsanitary conditions could contribute to illness. Bathhouses were therefore required to maintain water quality, enforce cleaning routines, and monitor usage. Inspectors occasionally visited to ensure compliance, checking for proper maintenance and observing whether patrons followed established protocols. In this way, rules surrounding cleanliness were not merely moralistic, they were also practical measures designed to preserve the health of the population. The rules governing attire and modesty in public baths were similarly detailed. Patrons were often required to wear specific garments, towels, or coverings while moving through communal spaces. Nudity or impropriety was strictly prohibited, with penalties ranging from fines to temporary exclusion from the facility. These standards reflected the broader medieval concern with social decorum and moral conduct, intertwining hygiene with behavior. Bathing was thus not only an act of cleansing, but also a public performance of civility, respect, and social understanding. Time restrictions were another important feature. Baths were divided into shifts for different classes, genders, and sometimes age groups. A working-class man might have access early in the morning, while a merchant or noble used the facility later in the day. Women were often assigned separate hours, ensuring privacy and maintaining social norms. These schedules created a quiet rhythm in daily life, encouraging routine, punctuality, and awareness of communal boundaries. Families, laborers, and travelers all learned to coordinate their bathing habits within these temporal structures, shaping both personal and social routines. Payment and access regulations were carefully monitored. Fees varied depending on social status, with wealthier patrons paying more for exclusive privileges, private rooms, or additional services such as massage, steam, or medicinal baths. Commoners paid modest amounts, granting them access to shared facilities but limiting certain luxuries. These economic distinctions reinforced social hierarchies subtly yet visibly, embedding class differences within the very act of bathing. Even in this basic activity, medieval society's emphasis on order, hierarchy, and fairness was evident. The rules extended to behavior within the bathhouse. Patrons were expected to maintain decorum, avoid quarrels, and respect both staff and fellow users. Social interaction was encouraged to a degree, but loud, disruptive, or morally questionable conduct was prohibited. Bath attendants, often trained in etiquette as well as cleaning duties, ensured that rules were followed, guiding behavior and maintaining a sense of calm. The bathhouse thus became a space of structured interaction, combining relaxation, hygiene, and social training in a controlled environment. Hygiene itself was closely regulated. Water had to be changed regularly, tubs cleaned, and floors maintained to prevent contamination. Soap, brushes, and scrubbing implements were often provided or prescribed for use in specific ways. Bathing procedures were sometimes formalized, with steps for washing, rinsing, and drying that all patrons were expected to follow. These protocols reflected both practical understanding and social expectation, ensuring that cleanliness was achieved in a manner consistent with communal norms. The rules around cleanliness also had moral and spiritual dimensions. Bathing was associated with virtue, propriety, and piety, and misconduct in the bathhouse could be seen as reflecting moral laxity. Religious authorities sometimes supervised or endorsed bathhouse operations, encouraging practices that aligned with broader ethical teachings. Public hygiene, therefore, was intertwined with personal character, and adherence to rules was both a practical and moral duty. In this way, the bathhouse became a space where health, decorum, and ethical conduct were cultivated simultaneously. Bathers often had to navigate restrictions creatively. For example, families might schedule bathing around work or school routines, coordinating multiple visits for different members. Travelers unfamiliar with local regulations had to observe posted rules carefully or risk fines or embarrassment. Local residents learned to recognize subtle cues about timing, behavior, and expectation, embedding these routines deeply into daily life. The act of bathing, simple in its intention, thus became a structured social ritual, linking individual action with communal order. Gender divisions were strictly enforced, yet flexible arrangements sometimes existed for family groups or specific social contexts. Mothers and young children, for example, might share access at designated times, while unmarried men and women were kept apart to avoid impropriety. This division reflected broader social norms about modesty, honor, and gender roles, and reinforced the way medieval society structured personal behavior according to both moral and practical considerations. Bathing was thus a microcosm of social hierarchy, teaching respect, restraint, and awareness of communal standards. Cultural rituals associated with bathing further emphasized its social and symbolic importance. Ceremonial washes, medicinal baths, and seasonal cleansing traditions often required strict adherence to local rules. Water was sometimes scented or heated with herbs, reflecting both aesthetic preference and perceived health benefits. Attendants provided guidance, ensuring that rituals were followed correctly. These practices connected daily hygiene to broader patterns of tradition, culture, and collective understanding, reinforcing the bathhouse as a space of shared experience and continuity. Economic and trade implications were also notable. Bathhouses often relied on imported soap, fragrant oils, or other supplies, and their operation contributed to local commerce. Attendants, cleaners, and maintenance workers were employed to ensure compliance with hygiene standards, creating an organized labor system tied to public health and social regulation. Patrons' adherence to rules ensured smooth operation, while enforcement mechanisms maintained order and minimized disruption. The law surrounding public baths, therefore, had both social and economic dimensions, shaping the flow of goods, labor, and participation in communal life. Illness prevention was a key motivation behind these rules. Medieval towns faced challenges from infectious disease, poor sanitation, and overcrowding. Bathhouses, if mismanaged, could exacerbate health risks, so regulations were established to maintain water quality, enforce cleaning routines, and monitor patron behavior. Inspectors, often municipal or guild representatives, ensured that standards were upheld, checking water, facilities, and cleaning logs. The careful oversight illustrates the early recognition of public health principles, even within the limited medical understanding of the time. The rules also influenced private life. Families prepared for bathhouse visits by organizing clothing, towels, and bathing implements according to prescribed standards. Children learned early about hygiene routines, social expectations, and the etiquette required in public spaces. Households coordinated schedules, planned attire, and sometimes arranged payments in advance. Bathing became not only a personal act but a communal and organized practice, intertwining domestic management with public regulations. Over time, public bath regulations evolved. Changes in sanitation knowledge, urban development, and cultural attitudes led to adaptations in rules, allowing for greater flexibility, improved facilities, and more accessible services. Some medieval bathhouses transitioned from communal spaces to more private or gender-specific arrangements, reflecting evolving social norms and technological advances. Despite these changes, the fundamental principles, hygiene, decorum, and communal oversight, remained central, demonstrating continuity in social values even as practical applications shifted. The rule about public baths also highlights the intersection of law, morality, and daily life. Compliance required awareness, patience, and social skill. Patrons learned to navigate schedules, fees, and etiquette, internalizing a structured understanding of personal and communal responsibility. At the same time, attendants and authorities guided behavior, maintained order, and ensured the safety and cleanliness of all participants. The system exemplified the medieval approach to governance, combining regulation with education, oversight with participation, and order with flexibility. Communities benefited from the rhythm established by these regulations. Daily routines were structured around bathing schedules, social interactions were coordinated within established norms, and health and hygiene were maintained consistently. The bathhouse became a space where social cohesion, personal discipline, and practical knowledge converged. Families, children, and travelers all learned to navigate these expectations, embedding lessons about responsibility, patience, and awareness of others into daily life. Even in moments of relaxation and leisure, the rules of public baths reinforced social order. Patrons moved according to schedules, adhered to etiquette, and respected authority. In doing so, they experienced the subtle structure that guided behavior without overt coercion. The bathhouse thus functioned as both a place of physical cleanliness and a training ground for social awareness, connecting personal habits to community expectations. Through this lens, the medieval rule about public baths illuminates the careful balance between regulation and human experience. Hygiene was enforced not merely for comfort, but for health, moral conduct, and communal cohesion. Compliance created order, discipline, and shared rhythm, while subtle adaptation allowed for flexibility, creativity, and personal participation. The rule demonstrates how everyday life was shaped by structures that balanced practical necessity with social guidance, producing patterns that were deeply ingrained and widely observed. Even as centuries passed, and bathing practices evolved with technological advancements and changing social norms, the legacy of these rules persisted. Communities continued to value cleanliness, respect for shared spaces, and adherence to social conventions. Individuals retained habits learned through structured systems, emphasizing organization, patience, and cooperation. The medieval approach to public hygiene, though rooted in regulation, ultimately fostered enduring principles that connected health, decorum, and community life. By studying the rules surrounding public baths, we see how law, culture, and daily practice intertwined to shape the lived experience of medieval people. Hygiene became more than a personal act. It was a shared responsibility, a moral duty, and a social ritual. The structures imposed by law-guided behavior reinforced social norms and created rhythms that influenced both domestic and public life. Within these frameworks, individuals learned discipline, creativity, and the subtleties of social interaction. The rule about public baths reminds us that even seemingly mundane regulations can have profound effects on society. They shape daily routines, organize social interaction, and instill values that endure across generations. In medieval towns, cleanliness was not only a matter of water and soap, but a reflection of order, morality, and community. The bathhouse, guided by careful regulation, became a space where people learned, adapted, and participated in a structured yet meaningful rhythm of life. In the medieval world, nightfall brought a quiet, measured rhythm to daily life, and one of the most influential rules governing this time was the enforcement of curfews. The ringing of bells, the closing of gates, and the presence of guards all marked the transition from day to night, signaling that ordinary activity was to pause and that citizens were expected to remain within designated areas. Curfews affected towns and villages, shaping behavior, personal routines, and the structure of communities in ways that were subtle, yet deeply ingrained. The rationale behind nighttime curfews was multifaceted. Safety was a primary concern. Streets were often dark, uneven, and poorly lit, and the absence of adequate lighting made accidents, theft, or assault more likely. By restricting movement, authorities sought to reduce risk and maintain order after sunset. Curfews also served to delineate the boundaries of personal and communal responsibility, ensuring that people remained within the protection of walled towns, guarded gates, or private homes, and minimizing exposure to dangers that could disrupt social stability. The sound of the curfew bell was central to this regulation. In nearly every town, a large bell or series of smaller bells would toll at a prescribed hour, announcing that the day's activities should end. Merchants closed shops, tavern patrons departed, and families returned home. The bell became a rhythmic marker in the lives of townspeople, signaling a pause, a transition, and a shared understanding of the limits of permissible activity. Its echo through streets, alleys, and squares reinforced the presence of law, even without an officer nearby, creating a sense of communal awareness and collective compliance. Curfews were enforced differently depending on social status. Nobles and higher-ranking officials often had exemptions or allowances, enabling them to travel for specific purposes or attend late-night events. Commoners, apprentices, and laborers were typically expected to comply fully, remaining within homes or designated districts. Gates were closed and watched by guards, who ensured that unauthorized individuals did not leave or enter the town. Penalties for violations ranged from fines to public admonishment, sometimes including temporary confinement, creating a strong incentive to observe the rule. The structure of curfew regulations influenced daily planning. Merchants timed their sales to conclude before the bell, ensuring that goods were accounted for and shops secured. Laborers scheduled their work so that travel and return trips aligned with the enforced hours. Families prepared meals and household routines to coincide with curfew, organizing chores, childcare, and domestic tasks with awareness of the night's limitations. The law thus embedded a quiet rhythm in daily life, guiding behavior and shaping the pace of both public and private activity. Nighttime curfews were closely tied to security concerns. Walled towns and cities relied on guards to monitor gates, patrol streets, and respond to disturbances. Unauthorized movement after dark could be perceived as suspicious or dangerous, and curfews created clear expectations that allowed officials to distinguish routine behavior from potential threats. Citizens learned to recognize the boundaries, timing, and social expectations of curfew, internalizing these rules as both protective and normative, linking compliance to safety, responsibility, and civic participation. The psychological impact of curfews was subtle but significant. Knowing that movement was restricted after a certain hour shaped perception, behavior, and personal habit. Residents planned interactions, social visits, and errands with careful consideration of timing. Children learned early about the limits of freedom, developing an awareness of boundaries and consequences. Even in leisure activities, the rule guided pacing, providing a natural endpoint to gatherings, celebrations, or communal work. The rhythm imposed by curfew became a quiet framework within which life unfolded, connecting individuals to community norms. Curfews also influenced economic activity. Market schedules, delivery times, and trade operations were coordinated to accommodate restrictions. Merchants could not rely on late-night sales or unsanctioned deliveries, necessitating careful planning of supply chains, production, and customer engagement. Inns, taverns, and other establishments adjusted hours to comply with legal expectations, ensuring that patrons could complete activities before gates closed. The rule shaped not only behavior but the functioning of the local economy, embedding legal considerations into everyday transactions. Religious and ceremonial practices were affected as well. Evening prayers, processions, and nocturnal observances had to be timed in accordance with curfew rules. Monks, nuns, and parishioners navigated these boundaries with care, coordinating spiritual duties with legal obligations. Bells and other auditory signals were used to guide timing, allowing participants to align devotion with compliance. In this way, curfews influenced both secular and sacred life, demonstrating the breadth of their impact and the subtle ways in which regulation intersected with daily practice. The enforcement of curfews relied on both formal authority and social expectation. Guards and watchmen patrolled streets, ensuring that rules were followed, but much compliance was achieved through communal understanding. Residents recognized the shared purpose of curfew, observing it out of habit, awareness, and respect for neighbors. Social pressure reinforced legal mandates, creating an environment in which conformity was maintained not only by oversight but by internalized norms and collective responsibility. Even minor violations could attract attention, reinforcing adherence through subtle social dynamics rather than overt coercion. Nighttime curfews also shaped social life. Gatherings, celebrations, and entertainment were scheduled with awareness of time limits. Weddings, feasts, and festivals had to conclude before the bell tolled, shaping the sequence of events and the rhythm of interaction. Music, conversation, and games were paced according to legal expectations, embedding structure within otherwise spontaneous activity. The result was a social environment in which order and leisure coexisted, with regulation providing a framework that guided behavior without stifling enjoyment entirely. The law also had implications for travel. Town gates closed at curfew, meaning that anyone outside was either trapped or delayed. Travelers had to plan carefully, timing arrival and departure to coincide with permitted hours. Innkeepers and wayfarers became familiar with curfew rules, offering guidance and accommodation to those affected. Families and merchants learned to anticipate gate closure, aligning movement and activity with the limitations imposed by the law. Curfews created both constraints and predictability, shaping the flow of people within and beyond towns. Curfew rules varied by season, reflecting changes in daylight, weather, and social activity. Longer nights in winter often meant earlier bells, while summer allowed extended hours. Authorities adjusted enforcement to account for practical realities, balancing regulation with environmental conditions. Residents learned to interpret these seasonal patterns, aligning behavior with shifting temporal boundaries. The law was thus both fixed and adaptive, structured yet responsive, teaching awareness of natural rhythms alongside social expectations. Children experienced curfew as both restriction and guidance. The bell marked a daily transition, signaling when play, errands, and outdoor activity were to end. Parents relied on these legal markers to organize routines, instill discipline, and teach responsibility. Early adherence became habitual, embedding awareness of time, social expectation, and personal responsibility into daily life. Over time, the curfew system shaped not only physical behavior but mental frameworks, teaching planning, self-regulation, and consideration of communal norms. The curfew also influenced architecture and urban design. Towns often had gates, walls, and watchtowers that facilitated enforcement. Streets, alleys, and squares were arranged to allow monitoring, patrols, and orderly movement. Lighting, when available, was positioned to illuminate paths and key points of entry. The built environment became a tool of regulation, embedding the rule into the physical landscape and shaping the way people moved, interacted, and perceived their surroundings. Compliance was not only legal but spatial, reinforced by the design of towns themselves. Even leisure and nighttime culture were structured by curfew. Storytelling, music, and social visits had to be completed before the bell tolled, shaping pacing, content, and interaction. Games, performances, and discussions unfolded with awareness of temporal limits, creating a rhythm in which anticipation, enjoyment, and closure were intertwined. Curfew became an invisible guide, structuring both behavior and experience, quietly shaping the way communities spent their evenings and nights. The gradual relaxation of curfew rules occurred as towns improved lighting, policing, and infrastructure. Greater understanding of safety, combined with technological advancements and urban expansion, allowed authorities to extend permissible activity without compromising security. Trade, entertainment, and social gatherings flourished under more flexible arrangements, illustrating the evolution of regulation in response to practical, social, and technological changes. Yet the principles underlying curfew, safety, order, and communal responsibility remained influential, shaping habits, awareness, and expectations long after enforcement became more lenient. Curfew laws also highlight the intersection of legality, social norms, and daily life. Compliance required awareness, planning, and respect for authority, while enforcement relied on both observation and communal expectation. Families, merchants, and travelers all coordinated activity with curfew in mind, integrating legal boundaries into practical and social decisions. Even leisure was structured, ensuring that enjoyment, rest, and preparation for the next day occurred within a regulated temporal framework. The rule exemplifies how law shaped the invisible rhythm of life, linking personal action to collective structure. By regulating nighttime movement, curfews reinforced broader social hierarchies. Wealth, status, and occupation influenced exemption, access, and flexibility. Nobles and officials could move more freely, while commoners were bound by strict compliance. These distinctions were subtle yet pervasive, shaping perception, behavior, and experience. Individuals learned to navigate these boundaries, internalizing patterns of restriction and privilege that reflected the layered social fabric of medieval life. The psychological effects of curfew were equally subtle. Anticipation, planning, and awareness of time became habitual. Citizens learned to respect the rhythm of day and night, internalizing patterns that extended beyond legal obligation. Children, adults, and elders alike adjusted routines, balancing freedom with responsibility. The curfew bell marked not only compliance but reflection, pause, and preparation for the next day. It created a temporal framework that guided thought, behavior, and social interaction. Even in periods of celebration, curfew maintained influence. Festivals, feasts, and fairs had to conclude in accordance with legal expectations, shaping the sequence of events, performances, and communal activities. Music, storytelling, and games were timed to respect temporal boundaries, embedding structure within social engagement. Authority, community, and individual action were interwoven, demonstrating the pervasive yet subtle effect of this regulation on medieval life. Through the lens of curfew, we observe how law shaped daily experience, social behavior, and urban life. It provided order, safety, and structure, while also guiding planning, discipline, and communal engagement. The rule about nighttime movement was not merely restrictive. It created a rhythm, teaching awareness, coordination, and respect for shared boundaries. Even as enforcement evolved, the lessons embedded in curfew practices persisted, influencing habits, routines, and the collective understanding of time, space, and social order. The story of medieval curfew reveals the quiet power of law to shape the unseen currents of life. It guided behavior without constant coercion, structured community interaction, and connected personal action to shared responsibility. Safety, order, and social cohesion were maintained through a rhythm of routine, signaling, and spatial awareness. Citizens learned to navigate these boundaries with care, creativity, and attentiveness, internalizing lessons that extended far beyond the immediate hour of nightfall. In medieval life, weapons were not merely tools of war. They were symbols of status, responsibility, and civic duty. Owning a sword, dagger, or bow carried legal, social, and moral weight. The possession of weapons was regulated with surprising care, and these rules influenced daily life, household arrangements, and personal behavior. Citizens, soldiers, and nobles alike had to navigate laws and customs that dictated who could own weapons, what types were allowed, and how they were to be stored, maintained, and used. Understanding these regulations illuminates the balance between personal freedom, communal safety, and social hierarchy that shaped medieval society. Ownership was often tied to social rank. Nobles were typically allowed to possess larger, more powerful, or more elaborate weapons, reflecting both their martial responsibilities and their elevated status. Peasants or townsfolk might be permitted only simpler tools, such as small knives, spears, or farming implements that could double as defensive arms. The law often dictated limits on size, quality, and quantity, aiming to prevent unrest, protect public safety, and reinforce social stratification. Weapon ownership was therefore both practical and symbolic, embedding social hierarchy into everyday life. Registration or approval was common in many towns and cities. Citizens who wished to keep a sword, crossbow, or other weapons sometimes had to obtain a permit or formally declare ownership to municipal authorities. Officials recorded details of the weapon, its owner, and intended use, ensuring that possession was legitimate and traceable. This system helped authorities monitor potential sources of violence, enforce civic responsibility, and maintain order. Residents became accustomed to the ritual of declaration, understanding that possession carried both privilege and accountability. Weapons were not stored casually. Medieval law often required careful placement and safekeeping to prevent accidents, theft, or misuse. A noble might have a secured armory, while townsfolk stored smaller weapons within homes or workshops, sometimes locked or attended to by trusted family members. The maintenance of weapons was equally regulated. Swords needed regular sharpening, bows required tension and care, and crossbows demanded careful handling of mechanisms. Neglect or improper storage could be punished, emphasizing responsibility as well as skill. Training in weapons use was another key aspect of ownership. The law often assumed that weapon holders would be competent and disciplined, capable of defending themselves and their community without causing unnecessary harm. Young men frequently trained under mentors within guilds or at military academies, learning not only technique but also ethics, safety, and social responsibility. Mastery of a weapon was therefore both practical and moral, combining skill with the understanding of the consequences of misuse. Weapons carried communal responsibility. Citizens were often expected to respond to emergencies, such as raids, fires, or uprisings, using the arms legally permitted to them. Municipal militias relied on residents to provide swords, pikes, or crossbows when called upon. In some towns, periodic inspections ensured that weapons were functional, accessible, and under the control of competent individuals. This intertwining of personal ownership and civic duty created a culture in which arms were both tools and obligations, embedding social cohesion within the practice of martial readiness. Economic factors influenced weapon rules. High-quality swords, polearms, and crossbows were expensive, limiting ownership to those with means or patronage. Blacksmiths, armorers, and merchants played a key role, regulating the supply of weapons while adhering to legal constraints. Guilds often oversaw production, sale, and repair, ensuring that weapons were crafted safely and distributed responsibly. The law intersected with trade, skill, and wealth, shaping not only access but also the broader economic landscape of martial equipment. Regulation extended to the transport of weapons. Moving a sword, spear, or crossbow through town, city, or countryside could require permission or adherence to strict guidelines. Carriers were expected to demonstrate responsible handling, avoid public disturbance, and respect social norms. Failure to comply could result in fines, confiscation, or other penalties. These rules encouraged mindfulness, reinforcing that weapon ownership was inseparable from social and legal responsibility. The type of weapon often indicated role and duty. Archers and crossbowmen had to maintain proficiency and comply with laws regulating practice and deployment. Swordsmen, knights, and nobles were expected to participate in military service, tournaments, or civic defense. Even small daggers were regulated for use within towns, reflecting concerns about domestic safety, crime, and personal defense. Rules were detailed, covering not only ownership but also appropriate occasions, locations, and methods of use. The regulation of arms was therefore both comprehensive and nuanced, integrating legality, morality, and social expectation. Ceremonial and symbolic aspects of weapon ownership were also important. Weapons often served as markers of identity, lineage, or office. Nobles displayed arms during formal occasions, tournaments, or public ceremonies, signaling authority and skill. Municipal officials might carry weapons as part of their office, representing both protection and civic responsibility. These symbolic roles reinforce social order, embedding meaning within the tools themselves and linking legality with public perception. Weapon rules intersected with crime prevention. Unauthorized carrying, concealed arms, or inappropriate use was strictly prohibited. Towns established patrols, watchmen, and inspections to ensure compliance. Individuals found breaking regulations could face public punishment, fines, or confiscation, creating clear deterrence. Citizens internalized these rules, learning that weapon possession carried moral, social, and legal obligations. The system balanced personal empowerment with community safety, teaching vigilance, awareness, and responsibility. Inheritance and gifting of weapons were regulated as well. Passing arms from parent to child, patron to apprentice, or noble to vassal often required documentation or oversight. Authorities ensured that ownership remained lawful, preventing unauthorized accumulation or misuse. Families instilled knowledge of care, handling, and ethical use, teaching younger generations both skill and the responsibilities attached to possession. Weapons were thus transmitted as part of broader cultural, social, and legal frameworks, embedding discipline, respect, and tradition into daily life. Hunting weapons were another regulated category. Bows, crossbows, spears, and traps had restrictions regarding species, timing, and location. Nobles often controlled hunting rights on land, and possession of hunting arms could be tied to legal privileges. Hunting was therefore not only a pastime but also a regulated activity, intertwining legality, economy, and social status. Skillful, lawful use was expected, with consequences for transgression reflecting both economic and social stakes. The law also influenced weapon aesthetics and quality. Certain decorations, materials, or craftsmanship were reserved for higher social classes or military officers. Regulation ensured that arms met standards of functionality and safety, limiting ostentatious displays that could mislead or provoke tension. Weapon design was thus both practical and symbolic, reflecting the balance of authority, status, and compliance embedded within medieval law. Training and competitions were tied to legal expectations. Tournaments, martial contests, and practice sessions were often monitored or sponsored by authorities to ensure fairness and adherence to rules. Skillful display was encouraged, yet misuse, recklessness, or disregard for regulations could incur penalties. These events reinforced both technical mastery and social awareness, teaching participants to respect legal boundaries while developing skill, confidence, and precision. Weapons also played a role in dispute resolution. Towns and villages sometimes relied on formal dueling or judicial combat to settle conflicts, under strict oversight. Participants had to meet requirements regarding weapon type, skill, and conduct. Rules ensured safety, fairness, and social legitimacy, providing a structured method for resolving tensions while maintaining legal and moral standards. Ownership and use were thus embedded in both private life and public justice, highlighting the multifaceted role of arms within medieval society. The psychological effects of regulated weapon ownership were significant. Individuals learned responsibility, self-discipline, and respect for authority. Awareness of legal, social, and moral consequences shaped decision-making and daily conduct. Citizens internalized the understanding that freedom to possess arms came with obligations, influencing behavior beyond martial practice. Compliance became habitual, embedding patterns of foresight, care, and consideration into personal and communal life. Weapons also influenced household dynamics. Families organized storage, maintenance, and training, creating routines that reinforced discipline and cooperation. Children learned care, respect, and skill from an early age, absorbing lessons that extended beyond technique to ethics, safety, and social understanding. Household routines were intertwined with legal expectations, shaping domestic life, interpersonal relationships, and intergenerational knowledge. The interplay of social hierarchy, law, and weapon ownership also created subtle tensions. Nobles and officials could wield authority and privilege through arms, while commoners were limited in both access and scope. Enforcement and compliance were often influenced by personal status, skill, or reputation. Yet the underlying principle remained. Weapons were tools of responsibility, requiring care, knowledge, and ethical understanding. This balance preserved order, reinforced hierarchy, and cultivated a sense of moral and civic duty across society. Maintenance and inspection rituals were deeply ingrained. Weapons were sharpened, cleaned, and stored with care. Towns often conducted periodic audits or inspections, ensuring readiness for defense and compliance with law. The repeated attention to these details instilled habits of diligence, patience, and respect for rules. Weapons were more than objects. They were extensions of personal discipline, civic responsibility, and social trust. The regulation of weapons also had long-term cultural effects. Techniques, skills, and traditions were passed down through families, guilds, and military institutions. Legal frameworks reinforced continuity, ensuring that knowledge of arms, ethical use, and civic obligation endured across generations. Cultural memory and identity were intertwined with the possession and use of weapons, linking individual mastery to communal values and historical continuity. Even casual or everyday activities were shaped by weapon rules. Travel required awareness of permissible arms, timing, and handling. Social interactions were influenced by visible displays of authority, skill, or compliance. Markets, festivals, and gatherings operated under implicit understanding of what weapons were allowed, carried, or restricted. The rules created a subtle rhythm in life, guiding behavior in ways that were pervasive yet largely unnoticed, shaping experience, perception, and social interaction with quiet effectiveness. The medieval rule about weapon ownership demonstrates the careful balance between personal liberty and social order. Weapons were not simply tools. They were instruments of responsibility, markers of status, and vehicles for ethical and civic education. Ownership required compliance, skill, and understanding, embedding legal, social, and moral principles into everyday life. Families, communities, and authorities collaborated in maintaining these standards, creating a system in which individual action was harmonized with collective stability. Through this regulation, medieval society cultivated respect, discipline, and foresight. Citizens learned to handle power with care, to anticipate consequences, and to integrate responsibility into daily routines. Weapons, though potentially dangerous, became instruments of learning, social cohesion, and cultural continuity. Ownership was inseparable from obligation, and compliance reinforced a sense of order, safety, and mutual accountability. Even as weapons evolved and warfare changed, the lessons embedded in these rules endured. Skill, discipline, responsibility, and respect for law remained central, shaping behavior and understanding long after specific regulations faded. The medieval approach to arms highlights the interconnection of legality, morality, and daily life, showing how regulation, responsibility, and social expectation combine to guide individual and collective experience. By regulating weapon ownership, medieval society balanced personal empowerment with communal safety. The careful oversight of arms reinforced hierarchy, nurtured skill, and cultivated responsibility. It shaped domestic life, public behavior, and civic duty, creating a framework in which freedom and control coexisted harmoniously. The rule about weapons, while strict, ultimately fostered a culture of care, attention, and ethical awareness, leaving a lasting imprint on the rhythms, practices, and values of everyday life. In the late medieval period, certain laws and customs had persisted for centuries, binding communities and individuals alike in routines that often seemed rigid, unnecessary, or even baffling. These rules had shaped everything from what people could eat, how they could travel, when they could bathe, to the weapons they were allowed to carry. They were embedded in daily life, forming the invisible scaffolding that governed the rhythm of towns, villages, and cities. Yet, change was on the horizon. A specific reform, subtle at first but transformative over time, began to untangle the complexity of these ancient rules, allowing personal freedom, communal safety, and social cohesion to find a new balance. This shift began quietly, often in discussion among town councils, noble courts, and guild meetings. Reformers observed that some rules, while intended to maintain order, had grown counterproductive. Curfews sometimes hindered essential commerce or delayed travel. Weapon regulations, though necessary for safety, restricted skill development and limited self-defense among commoners. Bathhouse routines, strict in their scheduling, prevented broader access to hygiene and social gathering. The law was inflexible and life had adapted around it, often in ways that were inefficient or socially awkward. These observations inspired the first steps toward reform. The change was neither abrupt nor universally welcomed. Tradition carried weight, and communities were cautious, respecting the long-standing authority of law and custom. Town officials worried about losing control, nobles feared a dilution of status, and ordinary citizens were uncertain whether new freedoms would bring chaos. Yet, reformers argued that rules should serve life, not constrain it unnecessarily. They emphasized that laws exist to protect, guide, and organize, but they must evolve alongside society's understanding of morality, safety, and practicality. Slowly, conversations turned into pilot measures, and small adjustments were made. One of the first areas to see change was public access to baths. Previously, strict hours, gender divisions, and class-based scheduling had made hygiene a carefully regimented activity. Reformers recognized that broader access could improve health, reduce disease, and foster communal trust. New regulations allowed extended hours, combined family sessions, and more equitable access across social classes. Water quality and cleaning standards remained strict, but the rigid hierarchy of timing relaxed, creating spaces where people could gather, relax, and connect without fear of breaking rules. Hygiene became more democratic, less about rigid control and more about shared well-being. Weapon regulations were also revisited. While safety remained a priority, authorities recognized that overly restrictive ownership prevented ordinary citizens from defending themselves or developing useful skill. New systems of registration, training, and supervised practice allowed wider access to arms. Families could teach children proper handling under guidance, while town militias incorporated citizen participation more broadly. Weapons became both instruments of personal protection and markers of responsible citizenship. The reforms balanced safety with empowerment, preserving the order of society while nurturing skill, confidence, and preparedness. Curfews, too, saw a gradual transformation, recognizing the challenges of trade, travel, and nightly social interaction. Authorities introduced flexibility based on occupation, season, and necessity. Markets could operate later under regulated conditions, travelers could move with permits, and celebrations could extend into the evening under supervision. The essence of curfew, safety, security, and order, remained, but it was applied with nuance, acknowledging the realities of daily life. Citizens learned to navigate these adjusted boundaries, enjoying greater freedom while maintaining awareness of communal responsibility. The cumulative effect of these reforms reshaped daily life. Citizens experienced a rhythm that was less rigid, yet still structured, allowing for more natural integration of work, leisure, family, and social interaction. Domestic life benefited as well, as households could coordinate routines more effectively, balancing chores, meals, hygiene, and recreation with fewer constraints. The reforms encouraged personal planning, mindfulness, and cooperation, linking freedom to responsibility in ways that previous rules had often obscured. Education and mentorship became central to the new system. Authorities and guilds emphasized instruction over strict enforcement, teaching young people about hygiene, weapon handling, social behavior, and civic duty. Knowledge replaced fear, and understanding replaced rote compliance. Communities flourished as citizens internalized lessons about care, safety, and respect, learning that rules were guides to living well rather than burdens to endure. The shift fostered a culture of trust, where adherence came from insight and habit, not merely fear of punishment. Economic life also benefited from reform. Merchants, artisans, and travelers could plan with greater certainty, coordinate trade across longer hours, and manage goods with more flexibility. Inns and markets adapted to extended operating times, increasing access for customers and boosting revenue. Local economies became more resilient, with commerce integrated seamlessly into daily rhythms rather than constrained by rigid schedules. The practical benefits of the reforms were clear, demonstrating that thoughtful adjustments could enhance both social harmony and economic prosperity. Cultural and religious practices adapted smoothly to these changes. Evening prayers, festivals, and community events were conducted with awareness of revised regulations, maintaining decorum while allowing fuller participation. People experienced a sense of inclusion and empowerment previously limited by strict temporal or spatial rules. The subtle shift reinforced shared values while allowing creativity, expression, and connection, illustrating how thoughtful legal reform can nurture both order and social cohesion. The emotional impact of these changes on communities was profound. Citizens felt a sense of relief, belonging, and trust. Where once rules had imposed tension or awkward negotiation, the revised system encouraged cooperation, mutual respect, and awareness. Families coordinated more easily, young people learned responsibly, and neighbors interacted with greater ease. Social bonds strengthened, and communal life became more fluid, nurturing a quiet harmony that was both practical and emotionally sustaining. Safety remained a central concern throughout these reforms. Patrols, inspections, and oversight continued, but their focus shifted toward guidance rather than rigid control. Citizens understood that rules were now a collaborative framework, designed to support collective well-being rather than merely punish missteps. Responsibility became internalized, and awareness of shared interest fostered vigilance and care. The law evolved from an external imposition to an integrated part of communal culture. The transformation also demonstrated the adaptability of medieval societies. Change was incremental, respectful of tradition, and attentive to practical realities. Authorities, guilds, and citizens collaborated to identify which rules were essential, which were excessive, and how adjustments could enhance life without compromising order. This process reflected a dynamic balance, where law responded to human need, experience, and insight, rather than remaining static and potentially obstructive. Through these reforms, medieval life retained structure while gaining flexibility. Citizens learned to plan, adapt, and exercise judgment within a supportive framework. Communities balanced personal freedom with collective safety, recognizing that rules are most effective when understood, respected, and thoughtfully applied. The rhythm of daily life became more intuitive, less burdened by arbitrary restrictions, and more aligned with natural patterns, social needs, and practical realities. Education, mentorship, and practice reinforced these changes over time. Young people absorbed lessons about hygiene, responsibility, skill, and ethics in ways that were integrated into daily life. Knowledge, rather than mere compliance, became the foundation for behavior. Adults benefited from smoother routines, clearer expectations, and more predictable social environments. Communities thrived as trust, understanding, and cooperation grew stronger, demonstrating the enduring benefits of thoughtful reform. By the end of this transformative period, citizens experienced a profound shift in the relationship between law and life. Rules that had once seemed rigid, arbitrary, or burdensome now served as flexible guides, supporting health, safety, and social harmony. Daily routines flowed with greater ease, family and communal life became more manageable, and individuals learned to navigate freedom responsibly. The balance between order and autonomy created a rhythm that was calming, sustainable, and inclusive, allowing medieval society to adapt, thrive, and endure. The legacy of this reform extends beyond medieval history. It reminds us that laws and rules, no matter how established, should evolve alongside society's understanding, needs, and values. Freedom and responsibility are not opposites. They are intertwined, and effective regulation fosters care, awareness, and community. By observing the careful adjustments to medieval rules, we glimpse the timeless lesson that thoughtful, incremental change can improve life profoundly, quietly shaping behavior, relationships, and social harmony. In reflecting on the journey from rigid control to considered reform, one sees how even small adjustments in law can ripple outward, touching homes, markets, families, and public spaces. What once seemed unchangeable became flexible, what once constrained became supportive, and what once divided became more inclusive. Citizens learned to navigate the world with confidence, skill, and ethical awareness, while communities benefited from enhanced cohesion, mutual respect, and trust. The medieval world demonstrates that rules, when applied thoughtfully, serve life rather than restrict it, nurturing growth, stability, and human connection. As we close this story, it is worth remembering that even centuries later, the lessons of medieval reform resonate. Patience, understanding, and careful attention to balance remain central to human life. Rules are guides, not shackles, and thoughtful adjustment can transform restriction into opportunity. Just as medieval citizens learned to navigate new freedoms responsibly, we too can carry forward the wisdom of adaptability, insight, and care in our own daily lives. If this journey through medieval life and the subtle power of change has brought you calm, curiosity, or quiet reflection, then let this be your gentle reminder. Subscribe so we can continue exploring the past together, discovering the rhythms, lessons, and stories that shape not only history, but the heart.